first Cypher of the week, and we're going into the last week of our season, and the season has been called the Life-Affirming Infrastructure Lab. This whole season has been an exploration of abolition of structures of harm and the creation of new ways of being based on cooperation, equity, and justice for all. So we've done this through a number of ways in this season. We've had our first ever yard art school, which was dope. It was 2 weeks exploring the provocation, Imagine a World About Prisons. We hosted some amazing artists in residence. We've had talks, workshops, and we are rounding up with the Radical Imagination Cypher. So a cypher traditionally in hip hop would be a mic, and you'd have like beatboxers, freestylers, artists all around it, all jumping on the beat to explore different ideas. And we kind of, as a play on that, what we're doing is bringing together pioneering ideas, incredible minds, and open curiosity through dialogue, prototyping, and experimentation. So we'll put some links in the chat for the lineup of the rest of the week, because there's some really cool stuff going on. So if you can join us at any other events, that would be lit. But for now, I would love to introduce our host and facilitator for tonight, Bryan Lee Jr. So a bit about Bryan Lee. He is the design principal at Colloqate and a national design justice advocate with over a decade of experience in the field of architecture. He's the founding organizer of the Design Justice Platform and organized the Design as Protest National Day of Action. Bryan has led 2 award-winning architecture and design programs for high school students through the Arts Council of New Orleans and the National Organization of Minority Architects. He works to give other people and practices the tools to pursue design justice themselves, spreading the reach of Colloqate's mission for generations to come. So, Bryan, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me? Everybody? It's good? Yeah? All right. Thank you. Yeah, in the spirit of a cypher, I'm going to be a lot more casual about this. I'm going to flow through a little bit of my presentation as it relates to hospitality, the kind of colloquialism of home, and how might that translate to what our collective home means, right? And how that kind of expands that definition. So I will just kind of start by noting again, like I said, my name is Bryan Lee. I run a small practice. We are 14 people between New Orleans, Louisiana, and Portland, Oregon. We have work across the country, some international work, but almost all of it is centered in Black liberation of marginalized people, oppressed people, and it is centered on civic, cultural, communal spaces. So intentionally, we are doing spaces that are public, that are civic, that are community-based, that generate and build on what community means. So how did that start for me? This is my nan's house. Well, this is my nan's house. My nan passed in 2017, but before that, the whole family kind of oriented our lives around this place. It was home for so many generations, so many parts of my family, and so many important moments in my family's history happened in this space. And so 2 things that I would want to mention. So out of this, when I was 7, I lived in Sicily, and I moved from Trenton, which is where this house is, Trenton, New Jersey, which is the hood, and moved to Sicily, came back to Trenton. And having the distance or the difference between those 2 spaces was immense to me. It changed how I thought about the world. It changed how I saw public spaces, and that I felt public space owed. Sorry. So what I said is that I felt that public space owed something to our families, something to our communities, and so it needed to be connected in that way. And so when I came back, I asked my parents, what does it mean to actually design a place for my grandmother to be able to engage in a community a bit more, to not hurt when she walked up and down the stairs. And they said it was being an architect. So I went down that path, but that path was centered in the support of family, of community, and to make sure that home was the origin point for all good things moving forward, right? When I was in college, I had a professor of mine here in the States who was from Germany. He told me the story. He said in the 1960s, he went down to Alabama, to Mississippi, and he did a head count. And that head count was really about how many white families went through the front door, how many black families went through the front door of any given building or the house. They said 80% of the white families went through the front door of those buildings. 80% of the black families went to the side or rear door of those buildings. And so in doing so, he didn't really understand what the kind of cultural connotation of that was. But the thing that I mentioned to him was essentially, 250 years, 300 years of slavery forced a spatial differential and how people engage in their physical environment. So yes, of course, the white families believe that the formal, prominent way of which you go through or interact with the architecture or the language of a building is through the front door, right? Like that is the intention. But for so much of that time, Black people were forced to go through the side or rear door of their house, right? And so it became a kind of a colloquial consideration in that the side door became the entrance to the kitchen. And so for generations to come, we saw the kitchen, we saw that side door as our entrance, right? We saw that as a space that was not just forced upon us by white people, but shifted its cultural meaning because Black people use that space on a more consistent basis, right? And so just by the sheer fact of a collective opportunity or collective consideration of people using, being forced to use certain types of spaces, it changed the DNA or the structure of that particular type of space, right? And so this work for me is really about how culture and how culture as a consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition shifts the output and outcomes of physical space for particular communities, right? That's the important key. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of that and how we try to do that work. Let's see. So like I said, a lot of our work is based in three kind of core constructs. One is, and these are kind of the meta concepts, but power, values, and care. The point being is that the history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. It is the landless versus the landlord. So this is a quote from Malcolm X, the speech to the grassroots in 1963. It is an anchor part of design justice, noting that land and its derivatives are the thing that drives so much of our economic, social, cultural considerations. When I say land and its derivatives, I mean crops, minerals, oil, food, and buildings, right? All of those things are made of the land or developed onto the land, right? And so who controls those controls the outcomes, directions of society. So when we talk about what liberation looks like, what freedom looks like, and those are not the same word, to be clear. Liberation requires some form of sustained land, control of land. It's about self-determination. Second, again, our values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. And so when we talk about values, we're really truly talking about who gets to impose their values or impose their values on a system, on that structure, and then who do those values impact on a more consistent basis, right? And then care. So care is, again, talking about design justice, what love looks like in public spaces. And so what I mean by that is just simply that if you are not a part of a community, if you don't actively seek to sustain and maintain the communities that you're a part of, then it's very hard to build a space that actually cares for those communities, right? It's going to be almost impossible, right? And so for this group, and for everyone we talk through design justice, it is about being a part of a beloved community. So you cannot be designed for a beloved community without being a part of that beloved community. The second thing to just add to that, there is no community. There are communities, right? There's no singular, right? There's always, every single one of us on this call is a part of multiple communities. We might have a prioritized community, we might have one that is dominant or primary, but that does not mean that we are not also a part of multiple communities. And it's the aggregate of those communities that are impacted by a particular set of oppressions that shift how we move and interact with the world. So when I talk about colloquialism, I talk about it from the sense that it is, I want to go back to this word, right? So up here it talks about colloquial as it's the informal use of formal precedent, basically informal use of familiar conversation. And the reason I find that just kind of fascinating for this particular purpose, and the reason that we're called Colloqate, is the combination of colloquial, that kind of sophisticatedly informal use of formal language. So the way that we shift and maneuver and channel language in multiple different ways is impacted by where that language is used. And so that might mean that in the South, in the North, in Birmingham, in Toronto, the way that we engage with that language is both familiar and precise, right? Like we can speak to one another and we have a common language, but also each particular location has a specific condition that it applies to. And so that's why the note of Colloqate is really about the sequence of people and place juxtaposed at a greater frequency of chance. It's supposed to be addressed and specific to land, but across community, right? So if you've heard me talk before, design justice is the anchor to this, but that I won't dig too deep into that. Really, the thing to take away is just to note that design justice as a practice is one of a pair, right? And that pair states that for design justice to work, we are actively challenging the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression. And then we are also seeking to explore or forward a radical liberatory vision for reparative design, right? And that's both in process and outcome. That requires us to think about not just what the pretty space is, but what the process is that gets us to that space. And if that process is not, again, culturally sensitive, culturally driven, then it is necessarily antagonistic in its very existence. And so, again, design justice asks us to kind of consider those things at its core. I'm going to go to how I view culture. So I mentioned earlier that we have a very specific definition for culture. So culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and the immediate conditions. And so just to kind of unpack that a little bit, the persistent circumstances of a collective community, meaning we are all facing the same rules, or we are all facing the same prejudices that are imposed upon a particular community, right? That kind of collective persistence over generations forces people to act and maneuver in a certain way, right? To create new patterns and routines based on those long-lasting impositions to a community. And then, like I said, so persistent circumstance and immediate condition, meaning, who is driving what is happening in a particular day in, day out basis. So any given community has a specific immediate condition that they're also facing that shifts and changes how they interact with the space. And so all of these forces, these biases, these bias powers that are environmental, geographic, social, they could be political forces, they are all imposing themselves against a community, right? And so our culture is a byproduct of these forces pushing against us, and then us having to move, right? Us having to find a way to survive, right? And so that in itself shifts and creates a pattern so that we make it easier for our for generations to come, right? We create things. And so I always tell this story about New Orleans, in that if you've ever been to New Orleans, or if you don't know what a second line is, this is where I live right now. If you don't know what a second line is a celebration of life and death that is a parade that goes through the streets 32 Sundays out of the year. And as a kind of anchor kind of consideration of a second line, we have a brass band, and we have hundreds and hundreds of people who are following that brass band throughout a community or throughout a city. And so in doing that, we laugh, we drink, we move it up. I mean, like, it's an amazing time, right? And cultures from all over the world come to the city just to do this. But they do it oftentimes without the recognition and understanding that the history of the second line is the fact that we couldn't bury our dead in the city. Right? We couldn't bury our bodies in the limits within the city limits, right? We couldn't get insurance companies to pay for us to bury our dead in the 50s and 60s. And so we have to create methodologies and methods to survive. And so we created a processional to walk people outside of the city limits, right? So we walked 4 miles, and we would put our bodies in a resting place that was safe and free from harm. In the 50s and 60s, like I said, we couldn't get insurance, and so the parades became a way to raise money year over year, right? And so we raised this money to make sure that those who died over the course of the year had some way to survive, or some way to recoup some of the funds that were necessary to bury their children, right? So that was extremely important. But if you just come to New Orleans and only laugh and have fun and dance to the streets, you never really understand the kind of significance of that moment, because that is a cultural consideration, that is a colloquial consideration that grounds and girds so much of this community, right? It's absolutely necessary. So that is often how culture is formulated, and it resonates both through our ephemeral interactions with the world and our substantive architectural, our spatial interactions with the world. So the parks, the civic spaces, the buildings that we create, they all start to stem from that. And so just as a sum, noting that culture is a collective coping mechanism is a way for us to have a collective and necessary trauma response to those issues. And I know I get a lot of pushback sometimes on the fact that it may seem negative. I don't really see survival or resistance as negative. I see it as the kind of joy of survival or resilience, right? Like, I think the point of culture is joyful. It is a way for us to find mechanisms to free ourselves, right? Culture is a way to find our way into some act of freedom. So that's extremely important. So I'm gonna just kind of go through this last little kind of status quo to liberation component, and then talk about a few kind of moments of liberatory practice and praxis that I think are relevant to the topic that we're talking about. First of all, I try to make this kind of handy chart for folks to see through a lot of the language that organizations sometimes use without any action bound. So we hear a lot of equality work. A lot of that has died out and been shifted to equity work. And again, this is not to say that any of this is well, it is actually. Some of it is better than the others, but I want to say, a lot of folks sat with equality for a long time. And really what that meant is that we were trying to be fair in the present and to affirm some sort of fairness in the future. It did not bind us to any action, right? Equality never said that you have to do or you have to repair for anything. It's just this assumption that we would do better moving forward. And we know that almost never happens, right? Equity, on the other hand, tries to do a little bit more. It tries to acknowledge a past so that we can be fair, or at least we can have some sort of assumptive fairness moving forward, right? But still, equity doesn't have a firm action to it. So acknowledgement is not repair, right? Justice then says we are going to recompense, or we're going to repair for past injustice. We're going to make fair in the present, and then we're going to remove barriers moving forward. And then lastly, when we seek to move towards liberation, we are talking about not just removing those barriers, but affirmatively influencing the future outcomes of those who have been historically marginalized through any given system. And so it's necessary to kind of have some sense of understanding those kind of hierarchies, and assess your actions, your drives, your organizing around what you're trying to accomplish. Do you want to just make sure that people understand that there's a fairness within your system, or do you actually want to go through the process of repairing for past injustices, right? I think that's a critical thing. And so in any of this work, then the four things that are necessary, it's not the only four things, but the four things that we do is acknowledge that every single project we do has to have some sort of acknowledgement and representation of communities that have been pushed aside by way of a project or a typology, or a given community. And so from there, every project has to have some sort of mutual aid. It has to account for the community it serves. It has to be a part of and be a lasting representative of that beloved community we speak of, right? Beyond that, we have to dismantle and create. So dismantling systems of oppression, dismantling racist systems, sexist systems, ableist systems, in every project we do. We have to find components and chip away at those systems. It also means that we have to create new systems that can continue to box out the systems that we've dismantled, right? Because those things will kind of continue to generate and try to put themselves back into a place of power. And then lastly, future setting. So we want to affirmatively influence those future outcomes, as we mentioned a bit earlier. And that requires us to think about what, whether it's an Afrofuturist or futurist perspective, can we set a precedent for what the future of collaboration, of community, of home looks like? I mean, I think about Yard House, and I have mentioned it. I don't know what it feels like, but I have mentioned it so much because what I have read, what I have seen, although it is not my home, it feels familiar, right? And so for me, I am constantly thinking about how we set a precedent for others to move forward. And so the folks that I work with in New Orleans, I send them to Yard House. I'm like, y'all should look at this space. You want to create something similar. You should kind of check in, right? And so I think that's such a beautiful way to kind of take these ideas and move them into replication across the world. So I'm going to go to a few projects, and then I will kind of open it up for a little bit of conversation. Before I move into those, or as I move into those, I want to note that when we talk about home, when we talk about the familiarity and the hospitality and the familiarity of home, we're talking about a warmth. We're talking about a connection that runs deep, that is so deep. And in order to get there, you have to acknowledge the ways in which culture is both evolution and revolution. Right? It happens instantaneously. We have major uprisings that shift how popular culture moves. But culture is a long-lasting kind of historical consideration. So I want to tell you a few stories. One is after Katrina, there were about 50,000 houses or homes that were destroyed, right? Destroyed or taken off the market. We went through a process over the course of about 10 years to get about 20,000 houses online, but a lot of them stayed vacant for a considerable amount of time. About 100,000 Black people left the city, and the makeup of the city shifted over time. So in the top left, you see a project that we call Blights Out. And Blights Out was a collective community effort to use the language of a second line, right? So the kind of cultural connotation and cultural language of a second line which often in its general form would stop by bars and restaurants on its way throughout the city. But we use that format to stop by these homes of people who are a part of our community, right? And to tell their stories. And so we had poets and musicians kind of be the kind of prime center. Give me 1 second as this family walks right by me. So part of that process meant that we gathered hundreds of people. We set up a map to talk about who lived in these places, how much the property went for before Katrina, how much it's going for now, its embedded debt, just the kind of DNA of this space. So we could talk about not just this property, but its relationship to every other property across this neighborhood, right? Because it's not just one, it's a connection, a cohesive connection to a lot of them. So this is one ephemeral way in which our work directly tried to engage with those narratives and those 4 kind of collateral considerations that I mentioned a little earlier. On the bottom right, you see Moms for Housing out of Oakland, who spent a ton of time squatting in housing that had been condemned or that was foreclosed upon, and demanding a right for decent housing, which is a standard, whether it's the Freedmen's Bureau or whether it's the Black Panther Party. We're talking about a set of parties who are specifically asking for the simplest thing. Can we have decent housing, affordable housing that we can live in, that we can maintain community, that we can kind of aggregate our resources, right? So I think part of the problem with the way that capitalism manifests itself, it ultimately detaches it ultimately stops folks from being able to form and sustain community, right? So that is a tremendous consideration. I want to maybe talk about a few quick projects that try to do all of those things. I mentioned the Lights Out project, but here's another project called Buildable Memorials. Again, these are quick touch. These are memorials that we're working on with community members to quickly deal with police violence, to deal with other kind of harmful ways in which people have been harmed by the state in some capacity. And so we work with local artists and community members to kind of build these sustained quick memorials to put up across cities. These are very quick, but the community building, they bring people together, and they are again acknowledging the people who have been harmed by a particular system. This is the Lights Out project I mentioned to you. I'm gonna kind of swing past that a little bit, except for I want to acknowledge one thing. In this particular process, one of the things that I will say is that we've got to be, like, if we ever want to get to a full understanding of what it means for us to exist in a community together and to have a clear set of components that relate to home, that relate to that hospitality, we actually have to unpack systems so we know what's getting in the way of us actually doing it. And what we found oftentimes is that we have to diagram systems and we have to have them really fully sussed out so that we can know what is preventing us from actually getting to a point where we can connect with one another in a more sustained manner. So, you know, using every project we have to build community, to go into spaces and to make sure that we are talking with familiar faces throughout the process, working with young people to see their vision actually implemented in space. This is a project with a group of young people to design a set of signs across the city. This is that second line, as I mentioned. Also, some of the young people designed these. We did teach-ins in community to kind of unpack It's one thing to say Black land matters, but what does that actually mean, totality? So again, we did teach-ins to unpack that a bit. We usually did them underneath or around these billboards. So we got a billboard that we used every month, and we would teach underneath. We teach these lessons underneath the billboard every month. So talking about disaster capitalism, pinpointing the Louisiana law or constitutional law that was preventing us from making a bigger impact on housing in the city. How one feels, not just in their home, but in their city, in their block, in their neighborhood, was extremely important. And so when you have racist monuments, this is a project called Paper Monuments, which addressed the issue that the city's landscape was dominated by racist monuments across the city for a significant amount of time. So what does it mean for us to reimagine what new monuments to the city of New Orleans might look like? Can we, again, do the same set of things, acknowledge, talk to people, make sure that we are distributing their stories back into the real world at scale? Can we work with people in community to build things together? Can we use our civic infrastructure, whether that's the libraries, the hospitals, museums, to kind of talk through things? We use our schools. As you see here, this is a Paper Monuments project, but you see in the background here, there's also a Lights Out. This is in a classroom with those young people who designed those posters. So this project occupied public space. It thought about public space as the means to create a more inclusive or remediated community landscape, essentially. And so whether we were talking about culture or family or legacy or women who kind of shaped the footprint of our city, we made sure that it was reflected back into the world in real ways. And we worked with 50 plus artists, 50 plus writers to do this. So it wasn't just the internal effort, it wasn't just us. And we created a series of posters that weren't frivolous, they were present. So on the left-hand side, I'll tell you one story on this particular project. There's a Desire Standoff. Desire Standoff with the Black Panthers in September 15th of 1970. The New Orleans Police Department and the Louisiana Sheriff's Department rolled 2 tanks up to the Black Panther headquarters and 200 officers, and they shot nearly 400 bullets through this house and threatened to run over the house with bulldozers or with the tanks. There were children in the house for the free food program. They snuck everybody out the back. Cut to 2017 when we were putting this up in the middle of the street as a mural. One of the downtown development street cleaners was looking at us as we started to put this up, and he was there that day, right? He started tearing up. He started to tell us more specifics about that particular day. And then ultimately, he sat out and became a docent on the street during his breaks and told everyone who got off the bus for almost 3 months about this story, right? So when we talk about the kind of remediation of place, we want to talk about hospitality and how we create spaces that do feel more like home. The remediation of those painful moments, of those histories that have been hidden and buried, is extremely necessary. Dorothy Mae Taylor in the center here helped to desegregate Mardi Gras in 1996. Her children now wear this image as a shirt to City Hall to continue to protest to this day. On the right-hand side, you see the Claiborne Highway, which cut through and as a byproduct, you have a neighborhood that has struggled for nearly 50 years to get stabilized economically, educationally, and health-wise, right? And so this is kind of the story of how that happened and how the city is thriving and striving to reclaim this as a space. So I'm at 45, so I'm gonna give us a little bit of time, but I'll flip through just as I wrap up to say, you know, I know I spent a lot of time on the necessity of culture being infused through every single part of this project. All of you know this, but I think it's sometimes more difficult to understand how it translates into a functioning set of projects in the real world. And you know, for me, I wanted to say I really appreciate y'all giving me a moment to kind of talk through this, because you know, as somebody who's I'm from a place, I'm from Jersey, but I'm also a military brat, so I've moved all over the country, all over the world, and finding home or claiming home is always a little bit difficult. And so I take a lot of effort and great stakes to try to figure that out. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, y'all, but I appreciate y'all giving some time to this. So let's have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I know you're a busy person, and we're not going to keep you too long. I'll invite anyone, if they have any questions, to either put them in the chat or come off mic, or any reflections. And while you're thinking of those, I literally could feel like my spirit shifting when you were talking about second line. Like I'm not familiar with second line, but I guess I'm familiar with like the aesthetics of New Orleans and how integral ceremony is. So even that, the recognition of the celebration of life and death and the history of who gets to grieve and how feels like, oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I guess I wanted to just pick up on that in terms of I keep thinking so much about how transformative grief is, and how transformative it could be if we gave it the space. And I wondered if you had any thoughts in terms of you've kind of shown us how grief has been instrumental in shaping culture in a place. And I was wondering what you thought about what grief can, like how grief can inform architecture, like how grief can have more of an informed relationship with the built environment.
Yeah, I mean, grief is a part of the process of healing, right? And so every part of the architecture, every part of a sustaining architecture that tries to heal parts of the community requires an understanding of the grief or the traumas that have been associated with that. The act of building a space is an act of remediation, regardless of when, where, and how you do it. And so I think for most architectural projects to actively do it, it takes on a deep historical set of considerations, and also both social and geographic, right? Like, so I think for me, yeah, it's noting that all pieces of architecture are both simultaneously acts of harm to land and acts of repair, acts of healing. And so how do you make sure that the act of healing outweighs the harm that's placed upon it by tearing up the ground or shifting people's kind of spatial imaginary?
You also talked about even that the role of like evolution and revolution, and that made me think of you know, how those things happen simultaneously. Made me think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Now, you know, we have a conversation pending about abolition and architecture and abolition, and I wonder if we could just kind of just give a little, you know, a little something to that, because I keep thinking about abolition as a creation project, and not just a destruction project in the way that the Ruth really uplifts. And so, I mean, I'm asking you like all of the questions, like knowing that you have to go real soon, but how do you think about abolition in relation to design?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing for me is like noting that there are carceral spaces that are not just simply jails and prisons. Like carceral spaces has found its way into every part of our society. And so, you know, London is the most cameraed place in the entire world, right? The United States has the most square footage of prisons, obviously, in the entire world. We house the most population of people who are in prison. And so, I think extending our understanding of what those spaces look like allows us actually a freedom to shift the typologies of design that we create to counteract those considerations, right? And so, I think of abolition. I mean, all of our work is abolitionist in some capacity, and we are ultimately attempting to dismantle or deconstruct those parts of the systems. And that also means that we actually have to understand the policies that are associated with those systems. One thing that has come up in my work more recently on a consistent basis is that we can go through an entire project. For instance, we're designing a workforce center, and we can go through an entire project, have complete agreement with the client about removing the necessity of a ton of cameras and making sure that police aren't on the campus. Just making sure that all of those things, those tools that are used to maintain a foothold on people don't go in the project. But at the last minute, the public safety office will be thrown into the project, and people defer to the power of police, right? And so it throws things off. And so preparing for all of those things, not just in typology or physical form, but really preparing for the process steps and the strategic steps that will interact or interfere with those outputs long term.
Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna open up and see. I think Adea's got a question.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for sharing the space with us today. I'm really interested in the work that you are doing with young people and in schools, and I guess I just wonder how do you approach the breakdown of systems when you're working with young people, and so that they I feel like we're working with young people at Yard, and wanting to talk to them about systems. It feels like, okay, well, what even is a system? How do we start that? Is there any kind of go-to resources you have, or how do you start those conversations?
Yeah, it's a lovely question, because we struggle with this for the first couple of years that we built out our project pipeline program. But the way what we landed on is that we would build over the course of a program, whether it's a 4-day program or 4-month program, this relationship between personal space, block space, neighborhood space, city space. And at every level, we understand the kind of systemic considerations at each. You got a concert as well, apparently. So I got a soundtrack today. So at each level, we kind of unpack the systems and scaffold off of the previous. And so when we talk about one's personal beliefs or personal relationship in physical space, and then we move to the lot, right? So we might move to the household, right? We might go from the personal space to the household size. Or what does your family think about, curfew? And then you might go to the block or the neighborhood. What does the city think about curfews in this space? When do the lights go off? And then you might look at it at the city scale. When does the city put a curfew on folks? And so to understand those sets of power dynamics up the scale, for us only worked when we could effectively move from their personal relationship to the not just to the injustice, but to the output of the system, right? Because some people have to understand other people's injustice. Sometimes they may not sympathize with it just yet, but they have to understand themselves through that lens. So that's what we try to do, is scaffold their understanding through that space.
I really appreciate that, even just in terms of locating that the systems that we talk about aren't like, they're not over there, that you know, exclusively, they're also within us and interconnected. So I really, really appreciate that, as a almost like a vocabulary and a context that you're equipping young people with as you move. Thank you. Has anyone got any other questions?
I have a question. So I really liked when you talked about your grandma's home at the beginning of the talk, and I just wondered, like, when you're approaching design like on a physical level, like how do you approach that to kind of hold a spirit and a feeling? Because I feel like that's something that is like so important to what we're doing right now. And it would just be so like to hear from a designer, for somebody who does that, like how do you approach that to kind of hold that spirit?
Yeah, it's beautiful, because for me, like my grandmother, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of I have this book called the Encyclopedia of Black Excellence. It's not called that, but that's what I called it when I was a kid, and it stuck, right? And she gave me this book, and I was looking for what architects were in this book. And I think the thing that I kind of took from her constant want for me to kind of grow and be more involved in this particular way was that the care wasn't just about me. It was about me in relationship to my cousins, in relationship to my aunts and uncles, and how we all could work together, right? And so out of love, out of care for one another, out of like a shared set of values. And so I think for me, it was, I think those three core things that you saw up front are part of how we carry all of those ideas into our work, but specifically the values of the care thing, right? Like when she used to talk about how our values are validated in these spaces, that's not the phrasing that she would use, but that was central to her core belief. And so I think a lot of it is embedded in those things. The other thing I would say is the primary, I skipped past the slide, but one of the first things we say as a matter of practice in design justice is honor the griot. Honor the griot, honor the storytellers, honor the people on the block, the Miss Mary's on the block, the Miss Ellen's on the block, that know what young person walked across that block for the last 50 years, know which cracks, when the crack happened in the middle of the street, right? They know everything about a place. And that was my grandmother. That was my nan. She was that Miss Ellen. Her name was Ellen. Right? She was the person who knew all the young people, who gave the young kids candy, who had all the secrets and the stories and the skeletons and the joys and the pains. She had it all. And I think that is the ode to her. It's really around how we honor those who hold those stories in our work.
Yes, Miss Ellen. It's making me think so much about, I know a lot of folks say, we're in a place of acknowledging and honoring the people who have come before us, that, the neighborhood OGs, the relatives, the aunts, the grandmas. Like, is there a way in which, like, how do we build like more intergenerational like coalitions around building, like what would it mean? I know we do a lot of work around like young people becoming architects. Like I'm like, I want to see my granddad design building,
Yeah.
What would that mean for like access?
That's a lovely question, right? So I think everybody doesn't have to be an architect. I think part of it is that we need to stratify what the profession is and means, right? And acknowledge that when I talk about the Miss Ellens, when we talk about griots, we're talking about the PhDs at the block. We're talking about people who have a lived history that will always, always, always far exceed that of even a culturally similar architect. Like I can't go into every community and then just ultimately believe that I have the answer, because I don't, right? But I have to be open to a point where it says to other people being involved in a process and shedding power, right? Like that's my job, is to be a conduit and to redistribute power where I can. And so part of it is, so we have we have one program overall. One is called, but two entities within it. One is, and both of these are to stratify the question. One is a CDO, or a CDO is a community design organizer. Community design organizer is someone who has organized before, who has some advocacy background, and they become a part of the design team and are talking with folks and helping us identify the spatial implications of a project, right? CDAs do the same thing. They are more connected. They are even closer connected to a community. They don't have to have organizing experience. They just have to have a community that they care about and love and have an affinity for. So that is the premise, is it's less about having everybody be an architect and more about how we open up the field to other voices, and not just open it to them, but honor those voices. We can't just open a door and say, sit in the fucking corner, excuse my language, but that's often what we do is or what the profession does is say, come in and sit over here in the corner and just pay attention to what we do, right? And that's just, it's not for me.
I feel like what a gorgeous place to drop your mic. Bryan, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, and I can't big up what you're doing enough. So thank you for being our peer. Thank you for this hour. Thank you so much, and safe travels, sir.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yes. And I'm trying to come out either in the fall or early. I'm not going to come in the winter. So I'm either going to try to come out in the fall or in the spring next year. So let's coordinate offline for that.
Exchange, 100%. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bryan. And thank you guys so much for joining us as well.
I love it.
Keep in touch. Take care, everybody.